Welcome back to a Saint a Week, and this week we have Saint Olympia, the Deaconess, or Olympia the Younger, as she was known. Saint Olympia was born around 361 AD in either Constantinople or Antioch. Constantinople at the time was considered the new Rome, established by Constantine, and it was becoming a major Christian capital. It was the eastern seat of power, where the emperor resided, and was a significant centre for theological development and theological disputes. Antioch, on the other hand, was also a leading centre of early Christianity in Syria, where the imperial court was based during the time. Olympia was born into a wealthy family, a highly influential Greek family in the late Roman Empire. Her father, Seleucus, was a rich rhetor, and her mother, Alexandra, came from a noble Antiochian background. She belonged to an elite network of political and intellectual figures. Her grandfather, Flavius Abliabus, held high office in Constantinople, while her uncle, Calliopius, was a learned rhetor who worked under Libanius, and later served emperors such as Constantius II and Julian the Apostate. Her family also had close imperial connections through her aunt, who had been engaged to Emperor Constans I, and later she married a king of Armenia. Olympia was also named after her aunt, which is why Saint Olympia was known as Olympia the Younger. Overall, Saint Olympia, she grew up surrounded by wealth, education, and powerful political ties. From young, Olympia's parents betrothed her to a wealthy man named Nebridius, who was the prefect of Constantinople. She was left widowed shortly after the marriage, and sadly both Olympia's parents pass away, leaving her with an immense fortune. Many a suitor were introduced to Saint Olympia, but marriage was no longer on her heart. Saint Olympia chose to devote herself to holiness, to charity, and to the service of the church. On the death of her husband, the emperor had appointed the urban prefect administrator of her property. But in 391, after the war against Maximus, he restored to her the administration of her large fortune. She gave a tremendous amount of her wealth generously to the churches, to monasteries, to hospices, shelters for the downtrodden and the homeless. She even built a hospital and an orphanage and looked after monks who had been led in exile from Nitria. In his church history, Sorsman relates, at the age of 30, she was ordained as a deaconess by Nectarius, the Archbishop of Constantinople. Palladius also writes that Nectarius took her advice in church matters. Nectarius was then succeeded by John Chrysostom in 397, and Olympia became the new archbishop's loyal friend and supporter. The saint fulfilled her service honourably and without reproach. Saint Olympia provided great assistance to hierarchs coming to Constantinople, among whom were Gregory the theologian and Saint Basil the Great's brother, Peter of Sebast. She did not regard her wealth as her own, but rather God's, and she distributed not only to good people, but also to their enemies. The nunnery she founded quickly grew to 250 nuns, aided by 50 other servants that she had dedicated for its use. It survived into the 7th century, when its abbess Sergia reported that relics relating to Olympia were recovered. Olympia had established herself as the leading spiritual director of Constantinople. When Chrysostom arrived in AD 398, it was predictable, therefore, that when John arrived, he and Olympia would work closely together to deepen and enrich the meaning of Christianity in a major see of Christendom. The pair grew close across the 6 years, and Olympia resigned herself wholly to Chrysostom's direction and placed at his disposal disposal ample sums for religious and charitable objects. Even the most distant regions of the empire received her benefactions to churches and the poor. When John was sent into exile in 404 AD, it was natural that Olympia would feel part of herself had been severed. Olympia often felt discouraged, despondent, and abandoned. Many were the women that she had to shepherd. Much was the opposition she faced, and a few of those who could, at a deeper level, console her soul. After the banishment of St. John Chrysostom, someone set fire to a large church, and after this a large part of the city burned down. All the supporters of St. John Chrysostom came under suspicion of arson, and they were summoned for interrogation. They summoned St. Olympia to trial, rigorously interrogate her. They fine her a large sum of money for the crime of arson, despite her innocence and a lack of evidence against her. After this, the saint left Constantinople, but her enemies did not cease their persecution. In the year 405, St. Olympia was imprisoned and ultimately exiled because of her unwavering loyalty to John Chrysostom and her refusal to recognise the illegal rival patriarch who replaced him. The saint underwent much grief and deprivation. John wrote to her from his exile, consoling her in her sorrow. And many of these letters exist still today. They are called the Letters to Olympia. I'd strongly recommend reading them as well. In the first letter, John writes to comfort Olympia, who is deeply distressed by the chaos and suffering in the church and in her own life. He explains that such turmoil is not unusual and that God often allows difficulties to grow before resolving them in a surprising and powerful way. The only thing truly to fear, John says, is sin. All other troubles, insults, persecution, loss, or danger are temporary and ultimately insignificant. To reinforce this, he points to scripture and reminds her that everything in this life passes quickly. His main message is that she should remain calm, trust in God's control, and not be overwhelmed by events, because even the worst situations are often fleeting and can be turned to good. In the year 408 AD, Olympia entered into eternal rest. She suffered from a long illness compounded by the emotional and physical strain of persecution, exile from Constantinople, and the death of her mentor, St. John Chrysostom. St. Olympia appeared in a dream to the Bishop of Nicomedia and commanded that her body be placed in a wooden coffin and cast into the sea. Wherever the waves carry the coffin, there let my body be buried, said the saint. The coffin was brought by the waves to a place named Brocthoi, near Constantinople. The inhabitants, informed of this by God, took the holy relics of St. Olympia and placed them in the church of the Holy Apostle Thomas. The accounts of St. Olympia's life are limited, to say the least, but what remains tells the story of an extraordinary woman, one who devoted her entire life to the church and was a spiritual leader to many. Born into wealth and privilege, she chose a radically different path, giving away her vast inheritance to support the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. And it's no coincidence that in one of John's letters to Olympia, he refers to St. Olympia as the divinely favoured lady. So that concludes this week's episode. As always, I'll put in the description the links to the resources and the letters that John wrote. And yeah, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.